Hey, what's up, everyone? Alright, so Jeremy Wainson asks, if you were to start a career as a web developer today, what roadmap would you choose to get to a phase in which you become hireable for potential employers? So I'm actually going to give you, basically, if I could go back in time, or I had to, and I could define that roadmap for myself, that's what I'm going to give you today. So this is going to be partially focused on front end, but I will touch on a few things that will help supplement some back end knowledge at the end of the video. So first of all, I'm a huge fan of Team Treehouse. At the very least, feel free just to take advantage of their free trial. It's what got me started. When I was first starting, I tackled, I think, the web development track. I think that's what it was called, but basically it dove me into working a lot with CSS, and I think that is very often avoided by a lot of newer developers because learning CSS can be frustrating. It's a different experience than learning JavaScript or HTML, but I'm going to give you some tips on how to get more comfortable with it so you don't have to skip over it. But my recommendation, if you're looking for a cheap resource, again, you can do this for free, but Treehouse is really good at teaching beginner concepts. It has really good beginner courses and tracks, and honestly, if you wanted a front-end engineer position, front-end developer position, what I'd probably go for is a front-end web development track, the full-stack JavaScript, and the React track. So all three of those tracks, I just actually took a look at them, and I just checked out their content. They do a pretty good job at updating their tracks, but those are the three that I'd recommend you get started with. But most importantly, when you're going through the tracks, supplement what you're learning with mini projects. So a lot of people, when they use online tools or online learning, even if they're reading articles, they have this false sense of confidence in what they're learning and what they're retaining. And so what I found was, and this is the reason I had to go back so many times to those courses, it's unless you apply that knowledge to something outside of what you're, like outside of your course, which usually will, the courses are usually designed to hold your hand. They're not super challenging. They want you to get through the course, so it's easy to look up answers, it's easy to learn the bare minimum needed, and people have a habit, and me included, people have a habit of learning what they need to learn to complete the course, but they don't understand the fundamentals or the underlying concepts that the course is trying to teach. And you will learn that from applying whatever you're learning through the tracks or the courses to mini projects. So if you're learning how to build out a navigation, and you decide to try to do it with floats, or you try to use some sort of positioning technique that's a little bit different than what you're comfortable with. You get through the course, you feel comfortable with it, then great. I'm going to talk about this in a second, but now you can try to build out the navigation for your portfolio website. So you have to think a little bit about, I mean, it's pretty basic, but you have to think about how many links you're going to want. You're going to need to think about the content on the page. And what happens on mobile, right? If you're going to have a blog, an about me, a contact, portfolio projects, and then you come up with 3 other links that you feel would be relevant, then all those links aren't going to fit on one line on mobile, so you have to be a little bit creative. And that might not be in your course, but that will influence you to look a little bit further and supplement your knowledge. So I think the biggest takeaway is courses like this are really good, but supplemental knowledge that provides and teaches the learning for that concept is phenomenal. It helps solidify that knowledge from the previous course, and this is why I would usually read other articles on top of whatever I was learning at Treehouse that would just dive into applying it in a different way. But anyways, like I said, CSS is pretty tricky, and a lot of people do get discouraged. And one underdog of a strategy for learning CSS, and I've said this a few times, but not often enough, is converting PSDs to HTML and CSS. So what a PSD is, it's just a Photoshop document that allows you to load up basically a design, a mock-up in Photoshop. You don't need Photoshop to do this. You can just grab images of mock-ups or designs and just do your best to translate that and code it out. And so doing that when you might not feel you're ready to build your own website just yet, and a lot of people kind of get tripped up on, okay, well, I want to build a website, but I don't know what it should look like, right? So you think about your portfolio projects, they need to look beautiful, and they need to be perfect for these employers, and so a lot of people will plan too much, and they don't feel they're good enough with design, where they won't actually start on the project. So this kind of gives you an excuse to take someone else's design, and this is just for practice. You're not copying it, you're not using it, you're just using it for practice, code it out. It's going to help you get a lot more comfortable with HTML and CSS. And then what I recommend, and what I'm saying right now, keep in mind it's kind of just a template. It depends on the position that you're going for, but I feel like building out a portfolio with at least 3 projects is a great start. So I feel like 3 projects, I feel like that's a really good number. But what people tend to do is they focus so much attention on the portfolio itself, right? So I hear, well, that's the first thing employers see, and that's true. That's definitely true, but you're not tackling an interesting problem with your portfolio. You usually are tackling a realistic problem or an interesting problem with your portfolio project. Your portfolio itself isn't that interesting, honestly. And what you're going to find, especially when these conversations get brought up in the interviews, they dive into the projects themselves, especially if you solved a problem that's slightly relatable to a problem that that company has faced. If you are using technologies that that company has used, if they can relate that portfolio project in any way with what they're doing, that's a conversation starter in an interview. So, focus on the projects. I would even go as far to say until you actually build out the portfolio website itself. Feel free to toss up a WordPress template. Just get the portfolio up and online. What's more important right away is your projects, is the interesting problems that you tackled to learn the stack, the languages that you needed to learn to get that position. You can always dive into the portfolio later, but I think this is a common misconception. People spend way too much time with the portfolio and then their projects are lacking, and it doesn't create any interesting conversation in those interviews if they even get to that. So tackle the projects first, and also even when you're diving into the projects, people, like when you're starting out, it's very common to have a little bit of perfectionism, to have those tendencies, and you want it to look good for an employer. You want it to look good enough so you're competitive. So a lot of people will refactor, and then they'll go back to their own old code, especially when they've completed another course or read a few more articles or looked at other websites for inspiration. They will go back and refactor the same project over and over and over. And so there's a point when you basically have finished that project and it's good enough to deliver. Most people don't know when that is, but one thing I can tell you is good enough is often just done, right? Especially when you're growing, because what's going to happen is the amount of growth that's going to be had when you go back and refactor your projects is going to be minuscule compared to tackling a brand new project, a brand new problem. It's just forcing yourself. When you go into a new project, it's forcing yourself to apply those concepts with a different perspective, which is going to help you retain what you're learning. And so focus on the MVP, the minimum product that needs to get out for it to be functional. Now, there's nothing saying you can't get a functional web app up, especially if you're diving into JavaScript, and then as you learn CSS, as you maybe even dive into a little bit of UX, to come back to that project and work on the front end when it was very, very simple and basic on the front end. So you can break that project and the steps to completing that project out into different phases and kind of structure that around your learning. That's okay. But what I'm trying to get you to avoid is to get in that constant cycle of refactoring and not getting the amount of projects out that you need to get out in order to grow a lot faster. So avoid that perfectionism as best as you can. I face that quite a bit as well. And I'm actually going to dive into a mistake I made that had definitely something to do with perfectionism. So, big recommendation I have: after you get your first project up, after you have something to show on your resume, something to talk about in an interview, after you've tackled a problem and you consider it done, like I said, MVP is done. When you consider it done, start applying. So what happened to me was I spent about 1.5 years with a big focus on learning PHP. And I didn't feel like I was good enough to start applying until 1.5 years later. And I stretched that out way too long. And what happened was, when I started getting those interviews, and they were pretty slim, but when I did start getting them, I realized I didn't really enjoy the work that was upcoming with PHP. I wasn't as interested in it. And I kind of figured that out a little bit as I started diving more into the front end, more into especially CSS. I really love CSS. When I first started, I absolutely hated it. But one thing I realized was, well, two things: that I didn't enjoy the jobs that were being offered when I talked to a recruiter, when I talked to someone on the development team. And I realized that 1.5 years later, and I spent so much time learning PHP, there was some growth to be had with that, but I could have grown in a lot of other ways. I could have worked on JavaScript much sooner. But that's okay, so I learned from it. Number two, I spent a lot of time learning so much of what employers didn't care about, and I avoided frameworks. I had this notion that employers wanted to see just completely custom code, no imported libraries. It showed skill. It showed you really cared about the language. And then all of a sudden, 1.5 years later, I get the question, well, what do you mean you didn't pick up a framework? Like most positions are going to use a framework, especially when you have a team of developers that have been working on a complex application that has grown enormously. It just, and trust me, it helps your team keep their sanity. But I had this notion where I had to custom code everything, and I didn't learn that was a mistake until I started going to interviews. And so even if you feel like these interviews, you're not ready for them, you're probably not, but there is so much growth to be had from it. There is an opportunity to solidify your roadmap as you learn about employer expectations. Please, I encourage you, try to get past the shyness, try to get past that lack of confidence. Just try, just apply. Once you get that first project up, apply and go to those interviews, learn as much as you can. You will realize that there's more to becoming a developer than just learning to code. A lot of people don't really work on their interview skills. They don't, yeah, honestly, especially with a lot of developers, they don't work on their people skills, and that's something that you can practice with interviews. So a couple other things to touch up on. Coffee dates are something I would go back and do, and what I consider a coffee date is reaching out to developers on a team for a company that's hiring, that gives you like this feel, this cultural feel that you might be a good fit, but you might not be sure. So reach out on LinkedIn to one of the developers, and I would just take a humble approach to it. Just say, I'm brand new to the industry. I'm sure you know what it's like, but if you have a lunch available, I would love to buy you coffee and learn more about like how you became a developer. You'd be surprised at how many people love talking about themselves and their journey. I'm doing it now, but you'd be surprised at how many people are going to say yes to that. Especially, and I would encourage you, buy them coffee, buy them lunch. It's going to be valuable. But a lot of people will go into that with the expectation that they should get the job, right? They put in the effort, they've connected with an employee, and they expect that employee to automatically try to pull their resume. Don't go into those types of conversations with that expectation. That's not fair. Go into it with the same expectation of diving into the interviews early, to learn, to grow, to get realistic expectations from a developer on a real team, not just some article or some Twitter post online, actually talking to a real developer that will give you their honest story and their honest feedback. And that's an opportunity to ask questions and get feedback. But reach out on LinkedIn. You're going to get a lot of rejection, just like you will with submitting your resume, but rejection is something that you need to get comfortable with when you're first applying as a developer. I promise you that. So last thing, and I think this is actually really essential, and I skipped this, and I wish I wouldn't have, but networking it's key. I remember teaching swim lessons a long time ago. Feels like a long time ago, but I remember teaching this family, and I taught this dad's two little girls how to swim. And they went from being really fearful with the water to just being super excited. They wanted to jump in, and I had to really hone in that excitement because they were trying to jump over people, and they were trying to just do stuff they weren't ready for and go into the deep end. But the family appreciated that so much that when I told them, I was actually heading to Chicago, gonna head out, and the father asked me, what am I doing? And I said, well, I'm gonna be looking for developer positions in Chicago. And he's like, oh, really? And so then he started talking about his consulting firm that was hiring a developer. So that was a connection without any effort that I was able to make, and that was just from putting myself out there saying I'm looking for a job, and because I already built that trust, built that connection, he was willing to fight for me. And so what you can do is you can build those connections, and I highly recommend you look at a site called Meetup. If you haven't already, check it out. Most meetups are going to be free to join, but it's an amazing free opportunity to just go to tech events, to get to know, first of all, to meet other people that are in your situation, that are really trying to get that first position, and you get to explore their projects, you get to explore different implementations, learn from them, and then, but you also, if they get a position, when you've developed that connection, a lot of times, they're going to remember that. And when you guys have kind of been talking back and forth and sharing your stories, building that trust, a lot of new employees will be vocal. If they're hiring another engineer, another developer, they'll mention you. And what's important is the cultural fit. And that's, you know, really half of the battle when you go into these interviews. Are you a good cultural fit? And when you've already connected with another employee that is, or the company has decided is a cultural fit, that's usually a good sign that you're probably going to be a good cultural fit yourself. So connect with other people at meetups, and you'd be surprised, especially with networking focused meetups, you'd be surprised at the number of recruiters and just CTOs and just people that are hiring that actually come to these events just listening. You know, and a lot of these events might give you an opportunity to put on presentations, but just go to these events, meet people, network. It really is who you know, not what you know. It's incredible, and I skipped that step, and I wish I wouldn't have. But those are really, I could go on to kind of little specific things, but I think any further advice, it's probably going to be a little bit more tailored to different roadmaps. Like, it depends on the position that you're going to be going for. So if you want to see more videos like this, or you have a specific roadmap in mind, a specific position in mind, let me know. I can definitely create a video on that. But as far as, because I did say I'd go into this, as far as back-end positions, the path is going to look very similar. What I would encourage you to do is, a lot of your projects should definitely have a bigger focus on the back end. Get comfortable with storing data in a database. Once you get a basic CRUD app up, you're just able to store data and retrieve it from the database. Then you could start being a little bit creative with it. But more importantly, get comfortable with building the full stack of your project. Sometimes when you are diving into the back end, there are going to be frameworks that are very back end heavy. If you dive into PHP, you might want to learn more about Laravel, which is, it's going to just handle the data in a very different way than if you were to maybe build an API driven app on Node. And where there, I would highly encourage just a strong front-end framework to be able to handle something like that. But it depends on the app. But you need to just try stuff, explore. I would even encourage you to try different databases. You don't have to dive deep into all these different areas. But with backend, I think the biggest focus is just getting that full stack project up. It's okay to dive into CSS a little bit. It definitely is okay, and it's definitely going to make you a stronger candidate. And I see a lot of back-end developers avoiding that. But often you're going to get positions that require you to at least have some exposure with a popular framework like Angular or React on the front end. So it depends on the positions. Look in your area, and you can use that as a starting point for the technologies and the frameworks that you should learn. But as far as backend, I think one more piece of advice with that is get comfortable with basic data structures. A lot of larger companies, at least in my experience, have given me more whiteboard-focused interviews versus project-based interviews. And I definitely had to be pretty comfortable with data structures, which I still, to this day, I feel like I'm not, and I'm still trying to grow with. It's something I'm definitely weaker in, and I struggled with the whiteboard interviews. But practice them. And I know it might sound silly, but just practice them in your bedroom. If you have someone else to be able to just kind of run you through it and help you through it, especially if they know the problem and they're able to have time to work out the solution in their head. I think just practicing the experience of working on the whiteboard problem and working with another developer that's trying to help you through it, almost very similar to pair programming. Just getting that experience is going to help you feel more comfortable in the interview process, because a lot of what employers are looking for in the interview process is, how pragmatic are you with solving the problem, but also, are you enjoying the challenge, right? A lot of these problems are going to be challenging, and a lot of companies will specifically pick problems that most candidates will not solve. And so it's really just about creating a pleasurable experience with the interviewer, just having fun with it. You know, if you are completely stuck, being honest, be very verbal, be vocal with your thought process. But just have fun with it. It's a fun challenge, even if you don't solve it. Treat it as something, especially in the interview process, treat it as just another opportunity to grow from it that you hadn't had before. So, and I could dive into that a little bit more. I think that's actually a pretty fun topic. But yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. So those are my tips for becoming a developer. It's kind of I went into a lot more depth than I thought I would. But if you guys, like if any of these ideas spoke to you and you want me to dive deeper into any of these, please let me know. Feel free to leave your experiences in the comments below, especially if it's different. If you feel like there was just something that you did that was very strong in helping you get that first position, because I can tell you I have not listed what I did. It's very unique. Maybe I'll do it in another video. But leave it in the comments below. Questions and feedback are welcome. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully this was helpful. Have a good night.
I've been cold to you, but you want nothing to do with me. So hopefully we'll coexist in time.